What if life in ancient Rome felt less like marble luxury and more like a noisy, risky apartment building? The stereotype goes like this. Roman city life meant elegant villas, baths, and public grandeur for everyone. But the people actually living through it were usually focused on food, work, warmth, status, and getting through the next few hours. If you followed an ordinary person from the moment the day began to the moment it ended, the biggest surprise would not be how exotic everything looked. It would be how structured life already was, even without the tools we now treat as basic. So rather than treating this as costume history, let us walk through the day the way a regular person would have actually experienced it. There was usually no soft landing into the morning. Morning in a Roman apartment block often began with noise before comfort. Stairs creaked, neighbors moved, smoke drifted, and whatever little room a household had became active all at once. The higher floors were usually worse, with more climbing, less convenience, and greater dependence on carrying what the household needed up and down through the building. In practical terms, the morning was about stabilizing the day before it could unravel. The first hour often decided whether the rest of the day would feel manageable or chaotic. That is why details like crowded apartment stairs mattered so much. They were part of the real pressure of the day, not decorative backgrounds somebody could safely ignore. If you slow the scene down, the routine becomes easier to read. Most people were not performing for history. They were trying to keep ordinary life from slipping out of control. That was when routine turned into sustained labor. Simple needs took work. Water often had to be fetched, waste had to be managed, and people had to get themselves out into the city quickly if they worked in shops, on streets, or in service. Rome had astonishing infrastructure at the imperial level, but living close to it did not mean every household enjoyed private convenience inside its own walls. There was rarely a clean split between home life and productive labor. This was the sort of work that held a life together even when nobody wrote it down as history. If you slow the scene down, the routine becomes easier to read. Most people were not performing for history. They were trying to keep ordinary life from slipping out of control. Moments like this also carried quiet decision-making. People were constantly judging effort, risk, timing, and whether the household could absorb one more problem. This is one of the places where modern assumptions usually fall apart. Meals for poorer city households were practical and repetitive. Bread, porridge, oil, olives, pulses, and cheap prepared food from the street mattered more than fancy dining scenes. Storage space was limited, fuel mattered, and spoilage was always relevant, which meant food in an insula was tied to money, space, and the daily rhythm of the surrounding streets. Knowledge of materials, seasons, and timing sat underneath these routines. The ordinary version is often more revealing than the dramatic one. Moments like this also carried quiet decision-making. People were constantly judging effort, risk, timing, and whether the household could absorb one more problem. This is exactly where the era comes back to human scale. The famous headlines stayed far away, while regular bodies handled the actual burden of the day. Later in the day, the physical side of life became harder to ignore. The physical discomfort of apartment life was hard to ignore. Rooms were small, privacy was thin, fire was a constant worry, and the smell of many lives packed together could not simply be decorated away. When people imagine ancient Rome, they often see monuments first. The average apartment resident probably noticed stairs, heat, smoke, and noise before anything else. The physical environment kept pressing on every decision. The body absorbed the price of daily life more directly than most people today are used to. This is exactly where the era comes back to human scale. The famous headlines stayed far away, while regular bodies handled the actual burden of the day. What looked small from a distance often decided whether the rest of the day felt manageable. That is why ordinary routines deserve more attention than the stereotype usually gives them. The routine also carried rules that had nothing to do with efficiency and everything to do with society. Class contrast was built into the city itself. The same Rome that displayed elite villas and public splendor also forced many ordinary residents into rented spaces with little control. Landlords, neighbors, and the daily pressure of rent all mattered, which meant Roman urban life could feel highly organized from above and deeply unstable from below. Social order showed up in tiny moments, not just in laws and ceremonies. That social pressure could be just as exhausting as the work itself. What looked small from a distance often decided whether the rest of the day felt manageable. That is why ordinary routines deserve more attention than the stereotype usually gives them. As daylight faded, the household routine revealed what this world really demanded. Night did not automatically bring rest. Streets stayed noisy, lamps were dim and costly, and the fear of fire or collapse never vanished completely. Apartment living in Rome was workable because millions made it work. But it was also a reminder that ancient urban greatness often rested on very ordinary people, tolerating a great deal of inconvenience. Nightfall did not erase the workload, it simply changed its shape. Evening did not erase the day's pressure, but it made the structure of that world impossible to miss. Seen up close, dark and loud, was not just a visual detail. It shaped mood, behavior, and the amount of strain people had to absorb before the day was done. When you put those pieces together, what it was like to live in a Roman apartment block stops looking like a staged history scene and starts reading like a real human routine. For huge numbers of Romans, urban life meant crowding, noise, and improvisation inside buildings that were useful but far from luxurious. That is the value of everyday history. It shows what people carried, tolerated, fixed, feared, and repeated when nobody was watching. Seen at ground level, the period feels less like a museum label and more like a lived-in